Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, I have the very distinct honor of having with me one of my Deleuze teachers, except this is really the first time that we're meeting in person. This is Claire Colebrook, and I have recently acquired Essays on Extinction, Volume 2, Sex After Life. And at the beginning of the pandemic, when I started the Acid Horizon podcast, I was reading Volume 1 of that. And it wasn't until recently that I sadly found out that Claire is going to be vacating the premises. That's right, she's going to be leaving Penn State University, where she is currently doing her teaching. And I found out because I found this in the used bookstore where we're at, which is Webster's Bookstore and Cafe in State College. And upon finding out that she would no longer be in my surroundings, I reacted to the crisis by calling her immediately. And we are now having a two-person consortium on Becoming Woman. And Claire, I just want to say thank you for coming to the show. I know you're a supporter of the show, and it's very good to have you in our studio today.
It's a great honor. Thank you.
And so let's just get right to what we're talking about here today. We're talking about the concept in Deleuze and Guattari on becoming woman. And this is a concept that's used, of course, in gender and sex studies. It's used just broadly in the sphere of Deleuzean studies. And the whole concept of becomings or minor becomings can be something that is maybe so foreign to the new student of Deleuze and Guattari that I thought it would be good just to start from the very beginning. Like, what is a minor becoming? What does it mean to be becoming woman? Why is this the central or most important becoming for Deleuze and Guattari? And then I want to address another claim that you make in Sex After Life, which is within the sphere of feminism, post-humanism, queer studies, that there has been a sort of moralized image of becoming woman that has become almost doctrinaire in a way and has ensconced itself in academia. And so hopefully we can unpack that a little bit. But let's talk about becoming woman, the basics.
Gee, thanks. So maybe start with a little bit of biography, which relates to Deleuze in the Anglophone world. So even though there's now like so many books on Deleuze that you probably, if I asked you to write a book on Deleuze, you probably couldn't cover all the secondary material. When I was asked to write a book on Deleuze, there was one book in English out there, introductory book. There was Brian Masumi's User's Guide to Capitalism and Schizophrenia. Charlie Stavali had written a book, but there wasn't really any introductory work on Deleuze. Deleuze was deemed to be a little bit on the crazy side. You know, you did Derrida, and if you were in philosophy, Deleuze was really on the margins. So there starts to be interest in Deleuze. And at the time, continental philosophy, I was in the UK, was very, very male-dominated, white male-dominated. So any continental philosophy event, you clearly could see the conference organisers going, "Oh man, we can't just have dudes here. We got to get a female in, and that Claire Colebrook woman, and she's in English, but she sort of does philosophy. Let's ask her to talk about Deleuze. And look, I'll do this. Claire, can you do Becoming Woman?" So it was just you're a female. That's what you got to talk about. It wouldn't have been my first choice. Mm-hmm. So looking back on it, you go, wow, this is really, really central. And it was more division of labour. This is what you're stuck with. That said, it's true that they make this claim, Deleuze and Guattari make this claim, it's the key to all becomings, or the beginning of all becomings. So there'd be a simple reading of Deleuze and Guattari, which Guattari, people keep correcting me with my stupid Australian accent, but fortunately I'll be back in Australia where I can mispronounce everything again with impunity. Let's say there's a hippie or a naive reading of Deleuze that would go something like this. Western philosophy is centred on what's being and present, knowable, stable, foundational. And Deleuze and Guattari celebrate becoming, the movable, the evanescent, the unstable. And instead of man as the subject of knowledge, becoming woman would be moving away from that foundationalism to something more fluid, dynamic, maybe let's just say revolutionary to give it a little bit of a political spin, counter-normative maybe, non-foundational, That's the easy reading. And so that you would say they're post-humanists in favour of man, they begin with woman or otherness, and from there move towards forms of existence that are more dynamic, creative, non-foundational, decentered, minor over major. If that's all Deleuze and Guattari are saying, then that's pretty banal and you don't need to read all that difficult stuff, right? And you could just go to any form of like 70s feminism that says women are more fluid, more other-directed, more into nurturance, care, affect over masculine reason, calculation, foundationalism. So what did Deleuze is just putting Deleuze in there, giving it some sort of philosophical consecration or value. I think the problem with Becoming Woman is that all it is? Right. And what I think is what I think is interesting is not that they're just taking one side of like the Western binary of becoming, time, woman, the dynamic, the fluid, the revolutionary, over being man, stability, foundation. The trick or key is it's not becoming, it's not woman, it's becoming dash.
Let's talk about that dash, because
it's the dash that's important, or the hyphen, or...
There is a sense in which, like, my initial understanding of Becoming a Woman when I first came to Deleuze and Guattari was that there is a positing of man as a central figure. They say that pure becoming is becoming man, but becoming woman is this other becoming, a kind of differential encounter. And those are pretty packed tight words. So how do we get from the dash to that?
Maybe because you use the word pure becoming. So let's say everything begins with the impure. And that might be politically problematic. Well, it should be, right? So you couldn't have an appeal to, let's say really naively, the pure other, right? So they're writing in a milieu where there's beginning to be like a critique of the West with the caveat that what is outside the West, outside man, outside that history of humanism, outside capitalism, which I think is the bigger problem, it's them, right? What would be other than capitalism?
Right.
And you couldn't say what is other than capitalism in some naive romantic way, thinking of when they're writing a form of feminist separatism or other forms of like pure indigeneity. And they make these racist adjacent comments about like the Chinese, the Indian,
of course.
Right? And so, one would want to put some little bit of philosophical sanitizer around that, which of course you can't really do. You can't clean up a corpus. It's going to have its moments of opacity where it didn't think itself through. I think Becoming Woman's a little bit like that. It's a sort of gesture towards an otherness that's sort of romanticised. But the dash, let's go back to the dash or the impure. It's not that feminism or woman offers some redemptive outside.
Right.
And I think the big takeaway from that, their whole movement, like it or not, right, is there is no pure outside, right? So that the forms of sort of popular Deleuzeism, that there could be a move that would get us to escape capitalism or escape Western foundationalism or Western metaphysics. They don't use that word, and I think for good reason. They don't see it as... The escape is not from philosophy or from capitalism, but the way they're entwined together to create a form of stability or everydayness that's hard to break out of. So the dash is what we have from where we are these concepts, events, existences on the borders that if one were to start to move towards them, one might create movement or disruption or change that might create an event within humanism and capitalism that might allow us to think differently. But it's certainly not woman.
Right.
And I think they're reacting, they are reacting to They're writing anti-Oedipus at the time of like Lacan, and woman does not exist. Like, so the Lacan idea would be there's this fantasy about pure plenitude. It's the feminine. Lacan says it does not exist, right? Live, and I think this still continues with Zizek. I'm not up to speed with Zizek right now.
You're probably better off, but anyway.
Yeah, I think I probably am. But I think, okay, correct me. If you're more up to speed than me, the Zizek is embrace your symptom. Woman does not exist. Like, suck it up, get over it, right? That's the big Zizek takeaway. Post-Lacan, right? Woman does not exist. There is no plenitude. The other is not robbing you of your enjoyment. You're essentially alienated. Suck it up. And I think it's that Lacan milieu that, at least in Anti-Oedipus, no, there is some form of otherness outside capitalism. Humanism, you never grasp it in its pure form.
Right.
You move towards it with the hope of undoing or creating an event within capitalism, humanism, Western philosophy.
Even though this was germane to my original understanding of Becoming Woman, I think it's something that has continued on in my mature view on it, which is the sort of doctrinaire or dogmatic view of woman that you're confronting and that has been misconstrued in terms of people working on Deleuze and Guattari is a sort of oppositional form of feminism, right?
Correct.
Right. The question is, how does it cash out? So how does the dash cash out in terms of, we often say, for example, that feminism is good for men.
Yeah.
Right?
It's good for everyone.
It's good for everyone, right? But the becoming dash also implies something that's good for everyone in the sense that becoming woman is good because it makes the structures which recuperate capitalism unsettled.
Yes.
How does it do that on Deleuze and Guattari's terms?
Right.
Like, why is becoming woman something that I should think about or read about?
Good point. So I would have, if I'm like making a case for teaching feminism to my students, I begin with, like, we're at Penn State, college town, football town, right? You have to begin with, just pedagogically, I don't care, even if you don't care about women's rights. Let's just assume you don't.
Okay.
It's still important to understand where you are, right? And the same would be, you can't read, pick a book, any book, Milton's Paradise Lost. If you don't have an understanding of all about the fantasies of gender and race, you can't understand Paradise Lost. So let's say you don't care about social justice. You're fine with white patriarchy. Even if you want to be a good reader of a text, you have to understand the fantasies that surround sex, race, sexual difference. Okay. So feminism is good for everyone is not, there's different forms of it. One is if we have a female president, then we'll all be a little more caring and there'll be more, we don't care about it. That's not the point. Feminism is good for everyone is like, think about your attachments and the attachments to woman, right, for example. And that's why I think it's important that it's becoming woman. See if this isn't too much of a tangent. Why are people so upset about trans women? Like, why, right? Now, easy answer is no one really cares. It's just a political issue that they're using as a football. Like, let's just attack trans women and use that to deflect attention. And it's a wedge issue.
Right.
I think it's more than that. I think people have attachments to the purity of sexual, like a man's a man, a woman's a woman, and let's just, and don't make me think about anything else.
Right.
So that's why I think becoming woman is important, not woman. Because if they were just to say feminism's important because in a strong theory of sexual difference, there's a different modality of existence that's not that of man, and if we start to think about that, we'll just be a better, more rounded political community. Becoming woman would start to undo all the structural attachments that create the normative subject that is capital, that is underpins capital. So I think becoming woman is not just undoing man, but undoing man-woman as some sort of structural binary. So celebrating woman is definitely not what becoming woman's about. It's undoing, I think it's undoing that strong male, female, borders of the subject, gender identity issues.
When we talk about the moralized becoming woman or the image of thought infecting certain feminist discourses. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Is it because there are certain strands of feminism that have a kind of triumphalism to them, a sort of Herculean character where we're inverting the binary and we're flipping normativity?
Yes.
And what Becoming Woman, the way that it should be read, is nothing like that at all. In fact, even the fantasy of a kind of finality undercuts what Becoming Woman really does. It's these series of incursions that happen slowly, imperceptibly, over time. I don't know. Can you speak to any of that?
Yeah. So the line is in Thousand Plateaus, never think smooth space will save us, right? So that I would say never think woman can save us, but then you would have to put in any of these redemptive outsides. So let's say you have two gestures towards escaping where we are. So the assumption of the milieu of philosophy we're looking at, Derrida, to a certain extent, Lacan, Deleuze, Foucault, right? Like we're interested in continental philosophy because continental philosophy is saying we're stuck in a certain archive and there must be a way to think differently. But you can't just say, okay, I've stopped reading and I'm now going to think from ground zero. That's that analytic philosophy. Well, it was when I was in an analytic philosophy department. It's you maybe you read a bit, but really you should be thinking ex nihilo, right? And there's two maybe responses to being stuck in the archive, like where, I mean, I know you've got this event on Hegel coming up, right? It's like, we'll get to the end of history and then we can stop reading everything and finally arrive at this moment of pure thought, but you had to have read all of philosophy to get there, right? So how do you get outside? And one of the ideas, let's say you take the Derridean idea, is you can't, right? All you can do is keep disrupting from where you are, like keep making incursions and trying to think otherwise than the norms of the present. And that would give you a sort of, I think, liberal idea of, well, we're always going to be compromised, but we can use, like, what if there were something like woman that would be different from, better from, more just than the concept of man and the human. I think what's challenging and valuable in Becoming Woman, and I would say that's Becoming Woman is the key to all becomings, but it has to move towards becoming imperceptible.
They talk about all over their corpus, becoming imperceptible.
Becoming imperceptible.
What is it?
So let's say you could take an extreme reading of it, which is I could finally escape all my attachments and think, sort of like the Spinozist dimension of their thought, what if I could think as if from nowhere, right? Like I'm no longer attached to all the Irigaray that I've read, and I'm no longer attached to feminism. Like I would begin with feminism as a social political movement. I would begin by championing women's rights, let's just say. But eventually that would disturb where we are to the point where then I would see, and this is what's happened historically, isn't it? Like there's a lot of, I think shares in feminism are pretty low right now, right? Because it's deemed to be, at least there's like been a couple of books on white feminism, and I think post 2016, how a certain form of white feminism,
the white fragility phenomenon. Yeah.
That feminism was just a way of giving, like, oh, if we elect Hillary Clinton, we'll have this new, more just, and then like that was a complete alibi for just keeping things going, right? So that you were just keeping neoliberalism going. So the way I see Becoming Woman, they say, is the key to all becomings, on its way to becoming imperceptible, that you might start with those identities or forms of existence that are on the edges of where we are.
Yeah.
But if you think they're going, like, and we could put any of the other redemptive, like becoming queer, becoming trans, becoming, you know, all they have these, as I said, racist adjacent or downright racist moments of the Chinese, the Indian. Right? The idea would not to be to latch upon those identities as somehow outside, but move beyond the outside, beyond any form of identification, self-annihilation. Isn't this podcast very attached to Bataille?
A little bit, yeah.
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 And I think that's a Bataille moment that there would be some form of like self-annihilation.
Yeah, absolutely.
In their thought. But I think where you were going with the question is you never arrive at that. I don't think in their corpus you arrive at, okay, we have become imperceptible.
Right.
We no longer have identities. So it is an anti-identity politics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, one of the things in our book that we talk about, I know you had gotten anti-Oculus, but I think about Deleuze's meditation on his wife, Fanny, who suffered from anorexia. And Deleuze talks about, for example, how anorexics will imagine when eating food that there's like little grubs and worms and things in it. So it creates a sort of imaginal circuit which prevents them from getting reinscribed into the patriarchal mandate, like, hey, you got to sit down at dinner. You got to make this dinner for me, or, or something like that. And this is kind of Deleuze's psychoanalysis, which I think it's a little bit problematic. And there's some presuppositions ushered in there that I'm not completely cottoning to. But at the same time, I think it does create an interesting provocation that the feminine imaginary, or at least the becoming woman imaginary, is one that is populated by these images or forces that kind of move you out into a space where you're not perceptible or you're not on the register.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned anti-Oculus. I'm one of these people that reads a book and then unless I do something with it, it's gone, right? Until someone's right. But I think actually the looking imperceptible is to not be perceived, right? So if you understand where they're writing in their milieu, I think the background text of Becoming Imperceptible is starts being a nothingness, right? Where you're either a subject who is looking or you're an object which is looked at, which is the Hegelian dialectic, right? A very, and that man is the subject of looking. It's the view from, that has no, that's why, they say there's no becoming man, right? Because man is that point from which everything else is viewed, mastered, represented, known. And when you look at anti-Oedipus, their tracing of the history of the subject begins with looking. One sees another body scarred, tattooed, punished, and that's Foucault. To look at another body being punished is to suddenly become in the position of the law. That comes from Nietzsche as well, festive cruelty, right? But the beginning of the modern subject is to watch another body being punished, tortured, pain inflicted, and to then take on the position of the looking position of the law. So becoming imperceptible would be at once becoming woman is to be looked at, right? And going back to the anorexic, it would be, I was going to say some of my best friends are anorexic. My closest friend is like currently in Australia, like in the healthcare system. And they make sure that when you sit down, you're being looked, when you eat, you must sit down and be looked at.
Wow.
You cannot eat. And apparently, so she tells me the worst thing is to be watched while eating. When you think of this, it's a monitoring, right? And at any rate, getting back to becoming imperceptible is to become not looked at, but not becoming, I must be the subject that looks at an object. So it would be to move away from that Sartrean, Hegelian, one is either a master or a bondsman, because it's the master, bondsman, bondsperson. That becoming imperceptible would be to break away from that Manichaean conception of the subject. Not be looked at, to not be becoming imperceptible. You cannot be seen. So it's against the politics of recognition. Which is, back to anorexia, it's to not be seen, not be noticed, exit, depart from, say no, refuse the world.
Right. So here's an idea that problematizes the whole becoming dash. And I get it from Gerald Ronig. We talked about him a little bit earlier. It's the idea of minor masculinities. that there's a way in which we can think about becoming man in a minor sense. Without sort of extrapolating the details of his theory, like just by me saying that, does that provoke anything for you? Is it possible, like in your view, given what you know about Deleuze and Guattari, to conceive of masculinity in the sort of in a minor mode?
I think it's like any of these unmarked categories. So there's, and shame on me for forgetting the editors, but there's been a recent book on cis feminism, right? Mm-hmm. And it would be the case if you pointed out to a lot of people that are out with the university scene. If you use the word cis, well, what is that, right? If you mark a previously unmarked identity, so the whole point of feminism was to draw attention to gender as a thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's not, it marks our activity. So minor, major is not a quantitative. There's more men than there. That's not true, right? It's that the majoritarian is unmarked. It's the silent, presupposed.
Right.
We need to think about women's rights. It just assumes, or we need to think about Indigenous rights, or we need to think about racial justice. Presupposes a position that's unmarked. So a minor masculinity would be, it's not the unmarked, neutral subject position, right? But it is something that has its particular attachments, modes, inscriptions, right? And there's a great episode of Donald Glover's Atlanta. Do you know that?
Oh, I know Donald Glover, but I haven't seen that.
Okay, so there's this hilarious, I think, episode where they play on, it's very edgy politically. So they have a character being interviewed who is black, who's coming out as white, right? And they say, and they play on these, when did you realise you were white? Well, I started drinking IPA and watching Game of Thrones and wearing chinos, and that was when I knew. And they're playing on that idea that the neutral is actually not. There is something very inscribed, particular, unique about white masculinity.
Right.
So, and that's what I think Glover's doing in that particular episode of Atlanta is saying you already have all this. Why are we talking about identity? Well, actually, masculinity is itself a form of identity politics, and it has its weird contingent attachments. I think the fact that he uses satire as the mode to convey that is like, these are things that are seemingly trivial, but that actually organise our politics. So a minor masculinity would be that sort of thing. Like, look at how it's composed from a series of contingent attachments. It's not the default option that has I do feminism and you do Deleuze. That's the way. Right.
I see what you're saying.
Right? We'll do some Deleuze and then you can bring the feminism in.
Interesting, yeah.
Right? It's not that. It's already going to have its particular identity politics.
So here's a question then, with regards to cultural signifiers. If being any identity is just an agglomeration of cultural signifiers, is there a way to think the dash in becoming as an absence of them or a diminishing of them? How does that work? Is it more sensate?
The way I read that, I think that's the most important thing in Deleuze. And I think it's attached to a form of Spinozist, Nietzschean, non-Hegelian. I think in many ways they are Hegelian, right? But the one thing that's not is to detach yourself from your attachments, to imagine that, and it's purely philosophic. That's what the value of philosophy is, and this is the bit of theirs that's not liberal. You can have your attachments, I can have my attachments, and we'll have a conversation in which we imagine that deep down we're all the same, right? That we have the idea would be, what might it be to look at the world, to look at the history of philosophy, to look at any political issue, maybe this is the right metaphor, as if you had no skin in the game. Now, you can't get to that, so that's why they say never imagine smooth space will save us. But becoming imperceptible, if you think of it, is to not have a point of view, right? To be like, and that's why I think Deleuze's most important books are probably on cinema and like being able to look as if you weren't in that particular position. The value of the camera is to create a point of view or a scene that is not from you and your body and your attachments. So there would be a politics that like really is an anti-identity politics. Not in the Fox News way of like, why are people talking about race? We should stop talking about race. We're over it. Not that anti-identity politics, but actually let's talk about those things and their attachments, right? And all the stickiness that they bring. So to say, on the one hand, like in a Judith Butler style, we are nothing more than the attachments we repeat. And perform. That's definitely there. But then they have perhaps beyond where Judith Butler would go, some philosophical enterprise. Like there's a real value for them in like philosophy, hardcore. And the value is like it would be some form of Stoic, Spinozist, Nietzschean, think as if it were not you or anyone, sort of anonymous thinking. Yeah.
Maybe one final question. And by the way, thank you. This conversation is excellent. If it weren't for the limitations of my recording technology and our appointments, we could probably do this for hours. But thinking about post-humanism, and your most recent book is called, let me guess, is it, if I can remember, Who Do We Kill to Save the World?
Yeah, who
would you kill to save the world? Which we'll put a link for that in the show notes. Given the sort of emergence of apocalyptic thinking and maybe even the anxiety and exigency of revolution, because now we're hitting a tipping point with climate and things like that. And of course, you'll have all of the naysayers of identity politics. Of course, we're doing something different here in this conversation. But with that said, is there a way in which Becoming Woman in particular, or Becoming Dash, attends to the concerns of the impending apocalypse?
Right. Which they don't really, I mean, that's not factored in at all. Right?
Of course, but I mean,
so
just
you
on your own
could say, you know, a quick take would be, well, it was great for, you know, Derrida to write Not Apocalypse, Not Now, and Deleuze and Guattari, like, End the World, you know, after Aimé Césaire's, you know, like the only thing to end is to end the world, right? Well, that was fine until the world was really ending, right? Now it's ending. This is serious.
Right.
Let's save the world. If you, the point being, the big question is, what do you want to save, right? And that there's no pure answer to that question, that saving something involves a degree of destruction. And it might be the things that we hold very, very dear, incling continental philosophy.
Right. Yeah, it's on the chopping block with everything else.
It's on the chopping block with everything. And so the way I see it is, it would be spectacularly awful for me to live in a world without this.
Right.
This is beautiful, right?
Right.
Books, universities, all the things that I've dedicated my life to. But if it were to disappear, it would not be the end of the world. Like the real challenge would be, I would find that life not worth living. A life without Deleuze, for me, is not worth living.
Right.
But the challenge is, and this is what I think Becoming Imperceptible is, to look at someone who has never heard of Deleuze or Western philosophy or Western metaphysics. One shouldn't look at that person and think, oh man. Right?
Right.
But just,
But we even look at ourselves that way sometimes, because we're talking earlier about, you know, getting in that space where you're at least temporarily devoid of your attachments, your research and everything else. And just the terror and isolation of now I have to think on my own,
Yes.
Connects to that. But, and so that makes me think that even thinking through the apocalypse involves a merger of that instance experientially and philosophically with the coming insurrection, as it were, right?
It's really, really simple. Look at where we are now. We drive everywhere,
right,
in the US, right? We are killing the future.
Yeah.
Every time we get in a car.
Yeah.
We're like, I guess we're just not thinking of the absolute, just take driving cars as an example.
Yeah.
Right? And we're like, well, it's a price to pay. That's insane.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I'm not doing this from a position of piety. I'm like, we all do it.
Right.
All the time. No amount of recycling is going to negate the damage we do. And that's not to say now you're putting it on the individual when it's really, Jeff Bezos, you should be tackling, not the person that has a Prius.
Right.
But my point being that it's those deep attachments that compose who we are that probably ought to be abandoned. And so I started with stop reading Deleuze. Well, that's the least of our worries, although that does come at a price as well. Yes. But it would be maybe if you acknowledge what ought to be done to have some form of life into the future, it might be so radical that you couldn't possibly embrace it.
Right. And that's just an impending tragedy we might have to accept.
It's an existential tragedy, yes.
Well, Claire, I want to say thank you. This was an excellent discussion. What is it that you're working on now amidst your move back to Australia?
I'm doing a literary history of moments that might look like transgender, but I'm arguing that it's a completely different way of thinking about sexual difference and human biology.
Oh, exciting.
So it goes back to sort of becoming woman, that why did we get so attached in the 20th century to sexual difference?
I see.
So it's a Foucault question.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Oh, great. It was wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you.